always been his issue, you know. So.
Yep. So we'll talk about that, but we'll kick it off now.
Perfect.
So good evening. I'm State Senator Jamie Eldridge. Welcome to another issue of Uplifting Voices, an opportunity for me to interview Black leaders from across Massachusetts, and especially lucky and grateful today to have Tanisha Sullivan, the president of the NAACP and a friend of mine since we went to law school together. So Tanisha, great to see you.
Always good to see you, Jamie.
And I know that we really reconnected a few years ago, I think, after you became president of NAACP, but we first knew each other at BC Law, and particularly we were both resident advisors on the main campus of Boston College.
Yes, it was fun times. We should reminisce, but what we have to share with people is that for those who know BC's campus, we were RAs together in the mods.
Yes.
So, which is a whole other experience on BC's campus.
Yes, absolutely. Yep. Party central for
it was.
BC.
It was. And I think they may have put like all of the law school students in the mods as RAs to help ensure that the peace was kept and that the partying didn't go on for too long. We were the law.
We definitely were a lot of grad students and law students there in the mods. Yep.
Exactly.
And I remember you were a very good RA and like really like doing lots of programming with your students, and I was not as good. So
no, you were great. you were great, of course.
Similar to our focus in law school. So
I really do look back fondly on those years, and I think we were very fortunate to have certainly a great law school experience. BC being, of course, one of the top law schools in the country from a learning and education standpoint, certainly prepared both of us for our careers. But at the same time, we had a wonderful experience being able to really be part of the BC community because we were RAs, right? So we were learning, in many ways from the university. And I thoroughly enjoyed my time as an RA and being there, working with the undergraduate students and, helping to ensure that their experience on the campus was a positive one.
Absolutely. And I certainly, I decided to go to BC Law, because, being a Jesuit school and focus on social justice. And I'm just curious in terms of, during your time in law school, did you sort of see yourself as being a leader on sort of, civil rights issues, racial justice, et cetera? Is that something you were focused on back then, or?
Yeah, but absolutely. I mean, this has always been kind of part of what I've been drawn to, just, whether it's through volunteerism or, the active engagement and kind of helping to lead nonprofit organizations. But before I get to that, I have to say, Jamie, you're being like uber modest. You were public interest law at BC. I mean, like, anybody who, on the campus, when it came to public interest law and that focus, you absolutely were the face of that during my time on the campus, and certainly a leader from day one on that front. So it was, of course, of no surprise to any of us that you would choose to dedicate your life to public service, and that you would be not just serving in the legislature, but be a leader in the legislature, really working to advance public policy solutions that impact the quality of life for residents here in the Commonwealth. So, I don't want you to be you are modest. So I'm going to make sure that we're clear, that the record is clear on that point. For my part, I wasn't sure exactly how I would really use my my experience, my legal background, to have an impact and to help make change. While I was in law school, I didn't have a clear path on that, as it
Mhm.
relates to
Mhm.
that, but I knew that that is what I wanted to do. When I
Mhm.
was in law school, for many reasons, and not the least of which financial reasons,
Mhm.
I decided that that I would pursue a career in corporate law.
Sure.
With the loans that I had, and just my financial situation at the time. And I mention that
Mhm.
because that's real. Um, you
Absolutely.
know, I chose to go into corporate practice where, to be able to earn, a salary that would allow me to pay off my debt. So we
Absolutely.
could talk about debt. We could talk about what do you call it, student loans.
Right. Being
But
RA can cover everything. That's
we
right.
could, okay. But I made that decision, but even in making the decision to go into corporate practice, it was very important to me that whatever I chose to do, I would be acquiring a skill set, building on skills that I already had, that I would then be in a position to use for the benefit of our community, and to be
Mhm.
able to help, again, ensure that all of us have access to the quality of life that we deserve. And so I chose to go into corporate practice, and very quickly started working with what was then Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under the law, now is Lawyers
Mhm.
for Civil Rights, as a
Yep.
pro bono attorney, and doing work around in their economic justice project around really providing support to small businesses, and
Mhm.
specifically businesses
Mhm.
of color, and helping them
Sure.
to understand, kind of the nuts and bolts of how you set up a business, and how you maintain a business, and really providing legal support and access to folks in my community. Again, using what I was learning in the law firm in my corporate practice. So it has my work in this space, in its civil rights space,
Mhm.
has certainly evolved and grown over the years. And what I will say is, although I started out my practice as a corporate lawyer, I have come to really value, really the label of, if you will, or the title of civil rights lawyer,
Mhm.
and really being able to use those legal skills in a way that really does seek to help make change.
Mhm. And you have been talking about being if the correct term is a corporate lawyer. So you've been general counsel to a number of biotech firms. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I started out my practice working for a law firm that had a pretty hefty client base within the life sciences, and which included pharma and biotech. And I actually landed, if you will, in that space. For those who don't know, when you go into like a big, and I worked in a big corporate firm. So all of my career in my
Mhm.
firm life has always been big firm. And when you go into a big firm, most people, you kind of, you go where they put you. And I was placed within the corporate group, on a team that was focused on private equity and M&A, within the life sciences and healthcare space. And that was primarily because between college and law school, I actually worked for Johnson and Johnson. So
Mhm.
my first like real job out of college, I worked for a pharmaceutical company. And so when I started my law practice in the firm, they were like, "Oh, you have some experience.
Mhm.
You're a junior associate. Go over there and work in that space." And so I was very fortunate to work in that space, and to work in the healthcare space, to work in the life sciences space, which, as we know, has evolved into one of the largest industries the biotech space has evolved into one of the largest industries and employers here in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. It wasn't so back then, but it is today. And so for now, over 20 years, I've been in this space. And because of that work within the law firms,
Sure.
I found myself in my in-house practice, again, working with in the biotech space. Oftentimes I get a question, people say to me, Jamie, especially because, in my civil rights work,
Right.
when we think about like the collaborations and the coalitions that we are a part of, for my tenure as president, I have found great alignment with Progressive Mass and with many advocates who would lean ideologically, sorry,
Right.
kind of on the progressive side. And so people say, well, how does that work? Because oftentimes when people think about pharma, when people think about biotech, it's like with a negative connotation. And, so I present somewhat of a conundrum for people, right? How does that work? Because people know me and they know the policy positions that I advocate for, that we advocate for through the NAACP. So it's like, how do we reconcile that? And what I will say is I've always believed from my first, day working for Johnson & Johnson back in the 90s, always believed that, healthcare access was critically important to ensuring the quality of life for all people, and that specifically Black people and other people of color and low income people were oftentimes, left out when it came to access to high quality healthcare. And so my view of the work within healthcare, within pharma, within biotech is that it can work, and it can work for all of us as a whole. And I see actually within biotech in particular, I find great inspiration there. Every day I work with people, scientists, innovators on the manufacturing side, who, in many respects are looking at some of, the most challenging problems in our, in our community when it comes to health, right? Some of the most challenging, life and death, right? And these people show up to work every day, like with a belief that there's a solution, right? With the belief that if we work together, if we stick to it, we're going to be able to solve this problem, and it's going to improve people's lives. And I've held on to that again for now 20 plus years working in this industry. And so as from a civil rights leadership standpoint, I believe the same thing. I do believe that, when it comes to tackling this issue of systemic racism, when it comes to really, again, dismantling and disrupting racist systems and structures, I believe it's possible to do it. Right. And so it's like, and I believe that if we build the right teams, if we have the right coalitions, if we really lean into this as a collective and not as individuals working in silos with our own interests, but if we truly do believe that there's a problem, believe that there's a solution, and that we work together, focused on identifying the best solution to eliminate systemic racism, that we can do it. I actually believe that. And I see it play out, again, on the professional side of my life, I see that play out almost every day, when we have, new innovations that come to market. So it's, this is, I
can feel that enthusiasm.
it is, it's true. Like people will say like, okay, how does this work? But again, I do find great inspiration in it because particularly in the advocacy space, when we're doing racial justice work or even gender equity work, there can oftentimes be so many disappointments. It's like you sometimes can feel like you're just pushing up against a steel wall that just does not want to move. And, it's that belief, it's that hope that things can and will change. That is a great motivation for me. And again, I have the benefit of seeing it play out in my in my other professional life, because I got two other professional life, on a regular basis.
Absolutely. And I mean, there's often, stories, conversations that, Boston or Massachusetts is not a friendly place particularly for Black professionals. And I'm just curious, sort of, have you seen changes in either the law sector or healthcare or biosector for Black professionals? Are things changing? Because you have this opportunity and position in great work.
Yeah, no, look, I absolutely believe that things are changing, but they need to continue to change, and they need to change quicker.
Yeah.
We have a lot of work to do. And, for me in this space, I do readily acknowledge that they have a pretty high bar for us here in the Commonwealth, and for us in the city of Boston. I do. But it's not a bar that I think we're incapable of clearing. I actually think that it's an appropriate bar, right? I mean, we have really so many of the components necessary to achieve greater racial equality and gender parity, and equality generally speaking, across this Commonwealth. We have, from thought leadership to financial resource, strong philanthropic community here, strong academic community here, strong business community here, right? I do believe in strong community. I think, by and large, the residents of the Commonwealth, are people who believe, inequality, and who are concerned about inequality, right? And want to do something about it. That said, I do believe that, that has led to, progress, but we also wrestle with, and it's so interesting, Jamie, we also wrestle with change.
Yeah.
Like we really struggle with that here.
Right.
Like we want to make change. And I do believe we want to collectively, for the most part, not everybody, but most of us, believe in, having an equal society, believe in this concept of a commonwealth truly being a commonwealth, like where we all, share in the prosperity of the commonwealth, right? But at the same time, when the rubber meets the road, and you see this because you're at the State House, and we're trying to advance public policy solutions that actually move us closer to justice, move us closer to being more of a commonwealth, we meet resistance.
Absolutely.
People are like, wait, that's change, and it's like, well, the only way we're going to make change is to change. Like you can't keep doing the same things and expect, again, a different outcome. And so I do think, as a society, as a community, it would serve us well to really spend some more time talking about how we make change.
Sure.
If that makes sense, right? Like, because I have been fortunate to, be in conversations with people from all corners of the Commonwealth, various backgrounds, various perspectives, again, different spectrums of the ideological spectrum as well. And consistently what I hear is people are, they believe in equality, they believe that we can be better. They believe that we have the potential to be the leader. But when it comes time to actually flick the switch, right, to make the to advance public policy solutions that will get us closer to that, people get nervous and
Right.
concerned. So I think we need to talk about that and
Yeah.
figure out why that is, because otherwise we're not going to be able to fully realize again kind of our potential
Mhm.
in being again truly a commonwealth for all people
Mhm.
within Massachusetts.
And you've had a particular viewpoint as you were elected president of the NAACP in 2017. Is that right?
Yeah, I took office in 2017, January
Yes.
2017. Yeah.
Yes.
Can you believe it? They did look when I decided to run. We did not know that, January 2017 was going to be the start
Yep.
of just, something new in the United States of America.
Yep.
It's going to be very different from the previous 8 years.
Yep.
But, you know, but things happen for a reason,
Yeah.
and I certainly came into this role, again, believing that I was picking up the mantle. At a
Mhm.
time when we had just completed 8 years or preparing to complete 8 years of an administration that was certainly albeit not perfect but certainly a lot helped to move us a lot
Yep.
further down the road toward justice than
Mhm.
the previous administration of that. um, but I found myself in January 2017, president of the NAACP Boston branch. It
Yep.
is a fully volunteer role. Um,
Yep.
and, at a time when our nation, we didn't quite know what was going to happen, but we knew something was going to be different. Um, but what turned out to be, a critical time
Mhm.
in our nation's history as it relates to equality, issues of
Mhm.
equality. And I quickly found myself sitting in this leadership role with the NAACP, an organization that, for at that point in time, over 100 years have been focused on, committed to the elimination
Right.
of racial discrimination in education, economic opportunity,
Mhm.
healthcare, climate and environmental justice, public safety, and voting.
Sure.
And
Yep.
who would know that each of those areas would experience such significant attack over
Absolutely.
the last 4 years?
Mhm.
And here
Mhm.
I am president of the Boston branch. And so I very quickly had to, whether I was comfortable or not, had to get comfortable in very uncomfortable situations, delivering uncomfortable messages, taking what for some were uncomfortable positions in order to make sure that not only were we not going backwards, but that we
Mhm.
were continuing to move forward. And
Mhm.
why does that matter? It matters because historically within this work, civil rights organization like the NAACP, we have historically um, worked with and relied on government to help move us forward.
Sure.
And here we are in 2017 at a moment in our history where we could not rely on the federal government, right,
Right.
to help
Mhm.
kind of move these issues forward. So we had to develop closer relationships with our state government and with our local government. But in addition to
Mhm.
that, Jamie, we also had to change the way we worked with and engaged our business community.
Mhm.
Because what
Sure.
became very clear quickly in 2017 was that the business community, although we know it has always had significant power and influence in
Mhm.
government, whether we like it or not, it
Yeah.
has.
Absolutely.
And so we very quickly, from a strategic standpoint, identified the private sector and the business community as a partner that we needed to cultivate.
Mhm.
Whereas
Mhm.
historically, the relationship was, somewhat rocky, right?
Interesting.
Or I should say, rocky and or transactional, right? Can you
Gotcha. Yep.
sponsor a dinner,
I agree.
right? That
Yep.
type of thing.
Yep.
For me, I believed that with the administration we had coming in, and also with, particularly here in Massachusetts and in Boston, really the strength and the respect and the power of our business community, that there was an opportunity for us to really uh, uh, transform the relationship, from one that, again, had been somewhat shaky and transactional at best, to being a relationship where we saw the business community as a partner in helping to advance policies that would seek to bring about greater equality. And so we were intentional about that, as a branch and as a strategy, again, kind of recognizing, kind of what we were facing over the last 4 years. And what I will say is, it has been fruitful. And it has, I think, really helped us here in the Commonwealth, to see, some policy changes that we needed to see. So you have people like, Bob Rivers at Eastern Bank, right? You have people like Roger Crandell at Mass Mutual. You've got, leaders like Jay Ash, leading business associations, trade associations, JD Chesloff, who are actively seeking, opportunities to, advance policy that is surely good for business, but even more so, in my opinion, just good for our Commonwealth and the people of our Commonwealth, right? So that was one. The other, that relates to that, though, Jamie, is in making the decision to, expand kind of who we would work with. It also meant that we had to, just as, I oftentimes say, we accept people as they show up. It also meant that in some instances we had to accept's not the right word, that we had to, understand that no business is perfect, no business leader is perfect, just like no advocate is perfect and no legislator is perfect, right? And so looking for the opportunities where there was alignment, where there is alignment, where there are opportunities for us to do good work together, became the focus. Again, understanding that we couldn't rely on government. And as the tenure of, Trump went on, it became very difficult to rely on the judiciary, as you know.
Sure.
Okay. We have almost a transformed judiciary over the past 4 years, right? So we could not say we're not going to work with, a certain, group, a certain stakeholder within our community. We had to find ways to work with people, to work with organizations, to work with industries that, perhaps 5-10 years ago, we may not have. But in order to stay focused on the mission, and the mission has always been equality, the mission has always been racial justice, equal opportunity, gender parity, right? In order to achieve the mission, we had to be willing to work with different coalitions, while at the same time, again, being focused on collaboration, but at the same time, not compromising our values, right? So
in these areas around state contracts, right? There's a lot of stories about both at the state and city of Boston level of not enough contracts with minority business owners. Is that an area where you're seeing progress, or?
Yes, I think on the city level, not so much. On the state level, yes. And I think that's yet another example. I mean, we have, again, from a ideological standpoint, the NAACP working with, the current administration at the state level might seem a little odd. But at the same time, what we have been able to accomplish, I sit on the governor's, sorry about that, lights just flew out. I sit on the governor's Black Advisory Commission. And, one of the issues that we identified very early on, of course, was around the lack of economic opportunity for Black families here in the Commonwealth, and really worked, you know, aggressively to identify the gaps, went around the Commonwealth talking about the issues, to identify the gaps and to make recommendations to the governor for how to close those gaps. I do think, what we've seen particularly in 2020 at the top of the year, and also now as we're rounding out the end of the year, is really the fruit of those efforts. With a focus on certainly revamping and restructuring the supplier diversity office in the Commonwealth, and also the policies and practices of that office, right? It's one thing to set up a new office and it's doing the same exact thing it was doing before. No, it's not. We're, completely restructuring and reforming in many respects the supplier diversity office in hopes that it will bring about greater equity and access to state contracts. So that is a positive thing. And again, yet another example of where, we have really tried to work with, find spaces where we can work with. Perhaps, the unusual collaborators to bring about greater access and opportunity. At the city level in Boston, we're still struggling as it relates to supplier diversity. We're making incremental progress, but I must say it's not fast enough. And particularly in 2020, against the backdrop of the COVID-19 public health pandemic, where we know, the economic impact has been felt by all of us, but has been felt most by our small and micro businesses, which oftentimes tend to be, owned and operated by people of color and low income people. It's potentially devastating. And so we really do need to make sure that as we move through this pandemic, we're not just focused on certainly the public health aspects of it and making sure that we stay safe from a health standpoint, but that we are running dual tracks and making sure that that we are focused on what recovery and reconstruction is going to look like for our small and micro owned businesses. Because Jamie, those are our neighbors. Right. Like, the Main Street micro business, those are our neighbors. Those are the people who, maybe they were our babysitter, when we were growing up, they were our elementary school classmate. These are our people, and we've got to make sure that they make it through.
The dollars stay local too, which is critical.
Absolutely. So state level, we're making more progress, I would say. From a structural standpoint, we still need to actively monitor to make sure that on the back end, these structural changes actually lead to greater access to the contracts on the back end. That does remain to be seen. On the city level, we still have work to do. And and I'm sure that's not unique to Boston. But what I will say, again, for me, the bar is high for Boston, because if it's not happening in Boston, it does concern me that it is very likely not happening in some of our smaller cities and towns across the Commonwealth, and representing really the majority of families.
Absolutely. And I will say in Acton, it's, my hometown of Acton, and what's been interesting is there's a growing Black community, both African-American, African or Caribbean immigrant communities. And there's been more advocacy about, from a lot of students, a lot of graduates of color, particularly Black and Latino students, saying, well, why isn't the school, in terms of the teachers, reflecting the diversity, increasing diversity of the school? And what I see is a lot of, promises or plans, but it doesn't actually turn into, reflecting a diversity at town hall, in the school district. And so what do we need to do to actually realize that for every community, not just Boston?
That's right. So, I am of the belief that, this work or change in this space does not happen overnight. right?
Mm.
And we can be impatient about the, wanting to see the change, while at the same time acknowledging that it's not going to happen overnight. It has taken
Mhm.
us 400 plus years to get here.
Yep.
And so we do have to be mindful that it is going to take time, to dismantle some of these structures and these systems and to make change from a policy standpoint. That said, what I look for, in this space, as signs of
Mhm.
progress is, certainly the intentional conversations and dialogue, that must happen, before actually, designing solutions, to these issues. And so I want to see in a community, that is, those that are increasing in diversity, as well as those that are still somewhat, homogeneous,
Yeah.
right? That there are conversations happening about race
Mhm.
and about, how race impacts how we're interacting with one another, how
Mhm.
race impacts how we think about the systems that are around us, right?
Mhm.
Whether it's, our school systems or it's our public safety systems, right? How does race play into that? And I think, the conversations, to me, are important because they help us to level set, right? I think sometimes we enter these conversations about race and racism and people say, I'm not racist, I believe in equality, right?
Right.
Like we make these statements, but like we never unpack the statements. Like, one of my favorites, I love saying to people, as evidenced by what? Where's the evidence? Tell me more. Like I want to, like, so here's a statement, right? We are an equal, we are an open, inclusive community.
Right.
As evidenced by what? Point that, and
Right.
it's not to, call people out, right, in a
Mhm.
negative way, but it is to help us better understand and perhaps uncover where our blind spots might be, right?
Sure.
Because we can't have a conversation about creating greater, um, diversity in our teaching core, at our high school, if we don't acknowledge, kind of how we got to not having diversity, or even what the implications of, that lack of diversity might be, right? So the
Sure.
conversation, so I look for in communities and in organizations, the conversations that are happening and
Mhm.
how deep are they going. I also look for, within communities and encourage communities and
Mhm.
organizations to, then start writing, right?
Mhm.
How, right, documenting what is the plan? Like what's the problem we're trying to solve? And what's our plan for tackling that problem,
Mhm.
right? And what's our timeline for doing so?
Mhm.
Right. And so when we think about teacher diversity, that's a space where, I'm deeply passionate. So I,
Yep.
I started practicing out of law school. And in 2013, I actually took a sabbatical from the practice of law and went to
Mm.
work in Boston Public Schools as the chief
Wow.
equity officer and did education policy work.
Okay.
And so I'm very passionate about that space and understand kind of the importance of teacher diversity, not just for diversity's sake, but really its impact on teaching and learning and how children learn and how,
Mhm.
really the quality of the learning and education experience for students. And it goes far beyond what students read in a textbook. It's also the
Mhm.
experience of interacting with someone from a different culture and
Sure.
background,
Sure.
right? And that adds value. Certainly the research shows that, that it helps to address, it's one of the levers, in helping to address, achievement and opportunity gaps,
Mhm.
for Black students, Brown students, other students of color.
Mhm.
But the research also shows that there's a benefit for white children,
Absolutely.
right?
Yeah.
When they're exposed to, diversity in their among their educators, right? There's a value and a benefit, for all. It's one
Mhm.
of the reasons why when we talk about school integration, for example, right?
Mhm.
Particularly here, like integration, here we go, right? Um, but yes, when we talk about school integration, it's not diversity or integration for the sake of diversity alone. It's about integration because of the value
Oh,
that
yeah.
happens when you have diversity in the classroom, students having the opportunity to learn from one another, from their different experiences and backgrounds, right? The questions that are asked will be different, and the responses may be different too, right? So there's definitely a value in having diversity among teachers, but also integration and diversity in the classroom among the students as well. And we can have a policy conversation about that, Jamie, because of course, if we're going to talk about education and diversity in education, then we've got to talk about housing.
Sure. And the suburbs look the way they do. Yep. Absolutely.
Exactly, and how we fund our schools, right?
Sure.
So I do think that it's exciting, as you noted, Acton and Metro West really becoming more diverse racially, ethnically, culturally, linguistically. I think that's exciting,
Yep.
and I also think it presents an opportunity to try to get it right.
Yep. Absolutely.
I mean, let's try to get this thing right. Recognizing that this doesn't happen overnight and it requires intentional action, right? And it's, I always say being good is not enough. Having good intentions is not enough. You got to do something. You got to do something.
Exactly. And speaking about do something, and I know we were just in touch on Monday as we were all looking to feverishly figure out what was in this police reform bill.
Yeah.
We had the conversation on Monday is that, this was a moment where because of the murder of George Floyd, because of protests, because of the Black and Latino Legislators Caucus, because of the NAACP and a few other civil liberties, civil rights groups, the legislature committed to police reform, back in June or July. But now we have this final product, and it's a complex bill, but I would love your sort of honest assessment, because I know one of the things you mentioned to me was, how is this going to tackle structural racism? And it falls short in many areas. It does some positive things as well. Not to put you directly on the spot, but how are you feeling today? How are you feeling tonight?
I love it. I love that we're in this moment and able to have this conversation, right? Because if we, were to a year ago, I would not have been able to guess this would be, that we'd be able to have this type of conversation. Certainly on Monday evening, I think most those of us who have been actively monitoring this, we didn't get much sleep Monday night because we were reading through the 140 plus page document, trying to make sure that we understood what was happening. That said, I do want to acknowledge that the piece of legislation, the bill that we have before us now in the Commonwealth, is more comprehensive, and does move us closer toward justice, closer toward racial equity than we were in January of 2020. Okay. If the governor were to sign it today, it would be better. It would move us further than I think many of us would have expected or anticipated. But for the murder of George Floyd that we all watched, some of us, unfortunately, multiple times have seen the murder of George Floyd, but for the murder of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many others, we would not be here. The question, though, for me in this moment, and I think it should be for all of us, is have we met the moment? Have we met this moment? Because something has happened in this country over the last 3 to 4 months. This awakening that we've had really speaks to us all seeing something that cannot be unseen. And in seeing that thing, the murder of George Floyd, it has caused, all of us of good conscience to be reflective of as to whether or not we've done enough,
Mhm.
And how have we contributed to a system that would allow that to happen?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so when I think about, in reading, the compromise bill, and understanding, kind of how we've gotten here to some respects,
Mhm.
um, there are, I would, there are very good pieces of this legislation. I am,
Mhm.
pleased that on use of force, we have, the outright ban on chokeholds.
Mhm.
And certainly a shout out to Representative Liz Miranda on use of force, right? That we've got the outright ban on chokeholds, that we have stronger limitations on excessive use of force. I remain concerned about the use of dogs as weapons,
Mhm.
because history has shown us that that tends to be racialized. And I am also concerned about the continued use of tear gas. But the bright spot on that end is, I think, in the compromise bill, there are now some requirements, as it relates to kind of members of law enforcement being proactive when they anticipate using those measures, and also on the back end requirements that they report out when they've been used, how they've been used, and why the decision was to use them. So for me,
Mhm.
that is a good thing,
Mhm.
although I would have wanted it to go further. Also, what I think is good, is post. I mean, that's central to this legislation. I would say that is, bless you, that is the heart of this legislation. It is a good thing that we now have a framework in place, to have consistent standards across the board for members of law enforcement, that we have a process to certify and decertify. I mean, we're both, lawyers, like,
Yeah.
we had to get certified and can potentially be decertified, right? you know, as cosmetologists and electricians, like,
Right.
welcome to 2020. Okay. So that's a good thing. Where, will remain concerned, is on the accountability aspect of post. When we look at the post commission and the
Mhm.
composition of post, I know, and I've read and heard, that law enforcement is very concerned that, of the 9 seats on the commission, they only have 3 that are designated. Doesn't mean that there can't be more than 3, but
Right.
3 that are designated,
Right. Right.
with that background, and are concerned about that. I too am concerned, that there are no designated seats for racial equity and racial
Right.
justice
Absolutely.
stakeholders.
Yep.
That concerns me, because in this moment, the reason we're here, the reason we have 149 plus pages of legislation, um, this portfolio of policy change and legislative changes, is because of racial injustice.
Sure. Sure.
Okay. And so the exclusion of, very intentional representation on that body of
Mhm.
individuals who have experience and background at looking at racial equity issues does concern me.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
However, we have, because of how, that the commission is designed and the appointment process is, it does mean that we will have to, actively monitor the appointments made by the attorney
Sure.
general as well as by the governor, and make
Yep.
sure that, the individuals they ultimately appoint have, in their background, not just knowledge and understanding of law enforcement and how it works, because I do believe that's important. That's where I agree with the unions on that. I think that's important.
Mhm. Sure.
Um,
Sure.
but also have experience and understanding of racial justice. And being
Mhm.
a good person is not enough.
Right.
Right. But really having an understanding of how that plays out, because the days of someone, burning a cross on their lawn so we can identify them as a racist, for the most part, are
Right.
gone. So you really have to have an understanding and a lens on how,
Mhm.
racism shows up, and how it plays out from, as we say, pattern and practice standpoint,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
In order to, be able to act. So great, post is great, but there are things that we will have to continue to monitor. There's also been much conversation about the numerous commissions that are, someone said this is the bill of commissions or something. I don't know. Something people are saying. Numerous commissions. A lot of punting going on. That said, I do want to call out two of the permanent commissions. One of which, actually, both of them we heavily advocated for, and one being the permanent commission on the status of African Americans in the Commonwealth. What people might not know is that there's been a permanent commission on the status of Asian Americans in the Commonwealth for about 10 years. And so we thought, look, if we can't get anything done in 2020, can we get a permanent commission? So I am pleased about that, and pleased primarily because that body will be tasked with really working in partnership with, I think, hopefully the legislature and the executive branch to identify where there are ongoing gaps, in disparities, of racial disparities that are impacting the Black community in the Commonwealth. They will have the opportunity to conduct research and to issue white papers and, to potentially advance policy positions that help to improve the quality of life for Black people in the Commonwealth. And so I'm I'm pleased with that, and hopeful in what that can be. I'm also pleased with the permanent commission on Black men and boys. That too, very important. Again, we can't leave 2020 and believe that we're changed in any way, or that we're on the road to change in any way, against the backdrop of COVID-19 and how it has ravaged the Black community from a health standpoint and an economic standpoint, and then of course the racial reckoning that impacts all of us, certainly those of us in the Black community, but absolutely strikes at the heart of the potential and the hope and the promise of Black men and Black boys. And so I'm so pleased to see that permanent commission. The others, my friend, we will look. I'm holding out hope, and I know that commissions, they say, these temporary commissions and task forces, they say don't hold up much hope for them. But I believe that we can make a new thing happen here. And I'm going to hold on to that, and believe that when it comes to qualified immunity, when it comes to civil service, when it comes to, really the systemic change that needs to happen within our prison facilities and with parole and probation.
That was the commission that I worked on, is the commission on DOC, because there is a real crisis in our prisons, not only disproportionate number of, Black men and women and Latino men and women, but conditions, treatment, reentry, education. It's just disgraceful and the worst in the country.
It is absolutely disgraceful. And I think, people oftentimes don't realize, they hear the data and they say, oh, we have one of the lowest prison, incarceration rates in the country. Okay. But when you just aggregate the data, we have incredibly high, disproportionate rates of Black and Latinx folks who are incarcerated in the Commonwealth. And to your point, when we talk about the treatment of those individuals behind the wall, we should be shamed. Again, here is an opportunity. It really is mind-boggling to me how we in this Commonwealth, with so many academic institutions and such a strong business community, are not able to provide people with the supports they need behind the wall, so that when they come back, they are prepared to be fully integrated back into our communities, as productive, self-sustaining, folks be able to get a job that allows them to keep a roof over their head, provide for their families like the rest of us want to do. So we do have to do better. And also, have to make sure that, while people are behind the wall, that the conditions that they're living in are humane.
Sure.
And that's a question right now.
Absolutely. And also gets to voting rights. We're right, because of a 2000 referendum, if you're convicted of a felony in prison, you cannot vote. Yep.
Well, so and the other piece, and I love that you brought up the voting rights piece, because that's something I know that there's some grassroots mobilizing happening here in the Commonwealth as well, particularly for those who are in jail, perhaps pretrial detention. For example, making
Sure.
sure that they do have the right to vote, but making sure that the system and the
Mhm.
structures that are in place actually create the access folks need when they're behind the wall ineligible to vote to actually cast that ballot.
Mhm.
Um, one of the things that, as we prepare to leave 2020 that I am happy about and excited about is,
Yep.
how we were able to really expand participation in our democracy. Um,
Mhm.
this election cycle. Again, who would have known that this public health pandemic would have presented such a rich opportunity for us to demonstrate, that if we have a structure in place that,
Mhm.
encourages people to vote and that actually has many ways for them to exercise that right, that people will engage
Mhm.
and they'll vote.
Yeah.
You know,
Okay.
what it says to me is that the structure that we've been working with has actually served as a barrier to
Yep.
participation,
And it's
right? And so as we
Mhm.
look at 2021, I'm really hopeful that we will seek to make permanent um, many of those quote unquote emergency COVID-19
Right. Yep.
election reforms. Because again, we are, as a Commonwealth, we are as strong as the participation or the access to participation that each of us has,
Mhm.
right, in our government. This is not a spectator sport. Like, our government was designed for civic engagement. Like, that's how our government was
Mhm.
meant to be. And, and I do believe that that it works well when more of us are participating. So the things that we can do from a structural standpoint to tear down barriers to access to participation in a democratic process, I do believe we should pursue those. So that's my plug. I'm hopeful that we're going to make those permanent.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's so many other issues we could talk about. I know we're nearing about an hour, and I don't want to take up too much more of your time. But are looking into 2021, assuming that we pass this police reform, that the governor signs it or makes modest changes, maybe the legislature rejects that. What do you see as a big sort of bold issue we should take on in the legislature for next session around systemic racism, around racial inequity? What
Yeah.
would you like?
So I think it's twofold. I mean, one, and we started this conversation with the legislature, probably a couple of years ago. I do believe it's important for the legislature to tackle systemic racism internally and
Yep,
also in its policymaking. Okay.
absolutely.
So, right. So I do, I think one of the things that, I'd like to see happen at the top of the year is a real commitment within the legislature to more training
Sure. Yep.
around systemic racism so that our legislators, to the extent they want to, right, that they have the opportunity to learn more about it. Because you can't design good policy that seeks to address systemic racism if you yourself don't understand it,
Mhm.
right? And so I'm hopeful that there will be an effort at the State House internally for there to be more exposure, more training for legislators and also for staff to
Mhm.
understand, which will, again, have an impact on the policy, I believe, that will be drafted and hopefully, moved into law, but also will have an impact on the culture of the building,
Mhm.
who's working in the building, what their experiences are. So I'm hopeful, right? So and so that's one. And then two, on the other side, when it comes from a legislative standpoint, I'm hopeful that, again, that the legislature will become more intentional about how racial equity plays into every facet of public policy, right?
Mhm.
We cannot do public policy and
Mhm.
not include race. We cannot do public policy and not be mindful of gender, right? Like, I'm hopeful that this will not be, we will move past the moment
Mhm.
where we have, the racial equity bill, right?
Yep.
And
Right.
we get to the point where everything, whether we're talking about environmental justice or climate justice, or we're talking about housing, we're talking about, economic, an economic bond bill, that we will get to the point as a legislature, as a Commonwealth, where we have consistently a racial equity lens. How is this legislation
Mhm.
going to improve the quality of life for all Bay Staters, right? And
Mhm.
in asking that question, understanding that it requires us to then say, and how is it going to impact those who have historically been marginalized by our public policy?
Absolutely. Well, that is a excellent goal, and really, this hour's flown by. It's so great to see you. It's been a while.
I know we could talk forever.
Yep, yep. But Tanisha, thanks so much for coming on to Uplifting Voices. I hope to see you in person soon, sometime in the new year.
Yes, yes.
And thank you so much for your work and advocacy. I really think without the NAACP's voice, this police reform bill and so many other bills would not be as strong. So honored to
Thank
have.
you.
Yeah,
Thank you, Jamie. And thank you for the work that you continue to do. Again, just always pressing forward on these issues, always asking the right questions, and really trying at every turn to ensure that our policy is just, and that, of course, it is focused on all people truly reaping the benefits. So thank you for your work and for the work of your team.
absolutely. Try to make BC Law proud. So just like.
Exactly. All right. Good night.
And have a good night. Okay. Take care.
Bye.
Mhm.